Thanks so much, Danny. Thanks so much. It was a great presentation. And so I don't know if I could actually unmute people. Jan Tobias, could you help me if you're around? So I can actually see you.
I can unmute myself.
Yeah, they have to unmute themselves.
Please go ahead.
So just call them by name one after another.
Or just jump in if you have questions, like Shirin and xcardpint. You can just clarify questions or #Snowden.
Yeah, so my question was regarding identifying trackers. So as far as I understand, you use disconnect me list for identifying trackers, which means that we are assuming that the same trackers that are active in web would be also active in IoT setting. But my question is that in general, there could be trackers that specifically target IoT devices. And considering that most of these devices encrypt their traffic, so in web, one way to identify new trackers is that we will try to identify personal identifier leakages, like email address, hash of email addresses, and then we identify this new non-first party entities to be tracker, and we add them. But I assume that most of this traffic in this case is encrypted, so we cannot see the payload or identify this PIIs. Well, how could we solve this challenge? How could we identify new trackers?
Two comments on your two responses. One, on smart TVs, we're actually able to identify new trackers. Gunesh, fill in, please, if you have any thoughts. But what we did is that we're actually able to decrypt the traffic, some of the traffic, and we're able to identify third-party companies to which the smart TV sent our personal information, and we identify those as new trackers that are not in the disconnect list at all. And most of these are actually video companies that do video tracking. We validated our findings by going to the websites of these companies, and indeed, we found in most cases these companies actually did video analytics. So that's in the case of smart TVs. We use similar techniques as you mentioned. We look at the traffic where we see personally PIIs, and then if so, we check if it's a tracking company. So that's in the case of smart TVs. In the case of IoTs, where we don't have the traffic, excuse me, or we don't have the payload of the traffic, it's much harder. We can only make guesses. Here are a few examples. We found many different kinds of smart home devices, like plugs, cameras. They all talk to a small number of companies that do IoT controls. These are like MQTT platforms for device controls. Whether these companies use the data for tracking, we don't know. But these device control companies are used by different kinds of vendors, different kinds of IoT devices, just for control, so that you can use your app to control. And these companies potentially have data about who the users are, where the devices are, how users interact with these devices. Lots of data about different users, different vendors of IoT devices. We call them just IoT data aggregators. Since we don't have evidence of tracking, we don't know if these are trackers, but these companies like Tuya, Tuya, these are Chinese companies. They're used by a lot of devices, and the fact that they have large amounts of potential user data, is something that we have not studied in the community, and I think it deserves more attention. I won't call them trackers right now, but these are IoT data aggregators, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thanks.
Maybe Shirin and xcardpint could clarify questions, please.
Hi, yes, I'm Xavier. So I just had a very quick question about, so basically you've been doing passive observation of what the data is, stemming from these devices and stuff. But since you have control over the relay, you're basically a man in the middle with your laptop there in the middle. What happens if you don't relay the data at all, or if you modify the payload, like even if the payload is encrypted, just scramble it or just zero it or something like that? Just observe what happens. Do you have any interruption of service? Do you have any effect on the device itself? Or because I guess the reason I think about that, there's the same way that there are browser extensions for all these tracking, all these trackers on the web, or there's emulators on your phone to circumvent all these permission issues. So you could have some kind of same technique there to prevent that.
We have not systematically tried to scramble the traffic or block traffic, but we have tried to do man-in-the-middle of the traffic. And some of these man-in-the-middling may not work because some apps on, let me say just smart TVs, some apps on smart TVs pin their certificates. We can't, or they validate their certificates, so we can't do man-in-the-middling. In some cases, if you try to man-in-the-middle traffic and and the apps actually validate certificates, these connections won't go through. And in some cases, if there's an app and the connection won't go through, the app simply crashes. So if you want to do some, our guess is that if you want to do blocking based on, say, connections and domains on some smart TV apps, our guess is that it won't work very well in terms of usability because the app will simply not load because it cannot talk to the advertiser. This is a different challenge. This is a new challenge because if you think about web pages, if you put in like ad blockers, in most cases web pages would just work. Some elements missing, that's fine. But for many smart TV apps, if you block a domain using, say, in our case, we try to man-in-the-middle traffic. If you block a domain, some apps will just not load and crash. So we don't know if there's a good way to block traffic on smart TVs without affecting usability. Let me know if that answers your question.
Yeah, for sure. I wasn't suggesting that is the way to go forward, but just out of curiosity, what kind of impact it would have, and if it actually crashes the app every time, or just on some messages or some domains and so on and so forth.
Yeah, we haven't done that systematically yet.
That sounds good. Thanks for the talk, Craig.
And speaking of just blocking domains, we also have a different project with University of Chicago where we try to block certain IoT domains in the firewall we built. Again, we see a similar issue. If you block certain domains, some IoT devices, not just smart TVs, just won't work. So blocking is actually may not be a good technique in terms of usability. So and there are definitely open challenges when it comes to like blocking domains in IoT. They're just different from the web world. More questions, please.
Thanks.
Yeah.
There's a question.
Okay. Hamid asks, scalability in gathering data traffic is actually a challenge, especially when we want to make a real-time decision is necessary. What is your idea? Could you clarify, please, Hamid? Like, it is a challenge to gather that traffic scalably. What do you mean by making real-time decision? Were you thinking about like blocking certain things? If you could clarify. Yeah, I know that it may be hard for you to talk, but I don't quite understand it. Or anyone who understands Hamid's question could please jump in. If you're thinking about like real-time firewall rules, yeah, I don't know what that means. In the meantime, any other questions from the audience?
Maybe at this stage, then maybe at this point, we should kind of officially wrap up and say thank you so much. We can continue with further questions later. And instead of just clapping, I have a sound effect for you. You see, they're very enthusiastic. So thank you so much. But like, if people wants to, hang out a bit longer, I'll be sticking around. So then, if you want to, Hamid, I think, wants to clarify his question, and for further questions, we can stick around. Thank you, Danny.
Thanks. Okay, Hamid asks, okay, real-time decision for detecting attacks. I see. Okay. If I understand your question correctly, Hamid could be asking, how do we use data collected from different IoT devices to make a decision whether a certain piece of traffic is an attack traffic? We're actually working on a paper on this, on about firewall rules, where we learn from real IoT devices what's the normal traffic. Turns out that depending on kind of devices, the learning period is actually different depending on kind of traffic. And that goes back to Ahmed's questions of real-time decision. Let's say that all you care about is just traffic from these little things. It's relatively easy to learn. If you have 3 users having this device, you can see that, oh, actually they all talk to the same domains because these actually talk to a single domain. That's easy. Look at 3, 4 devices, and then we're good to go. We can probably make a decision about what is good or what is potentially anomalous traffic for simple devices like this. But for more complex devices like this Amazon Echo, this supports third-party applications known as skills, is a little bit more difficult because we in our current paper that's unpublished right now, we have to see at least dozens, I forgot the number, but dozens of these devices for us to be relatively sure what a piece of traffic, what a piece of destination would be classified under normal. So depending on the kind of devices, like a simple device like this, we can probably make real-time decision relatively early with a small number of devices being learned. Whereas for complex devices like this or smart TVs, the duration of time for learning and the number of data points needed for learning is way bigger. So let me know if that answers your question about making real-time decisions as to what kind of traffic is anonymous versus not. For Hamid and for others.
Then if I may ask you a question, so at the collection point, the IP addresses these devices are talking to, maybe you also observe the DNS queries and responses. Not sure. But do you see any problems with the encrypted SNI and DNS, being more and more encrypted these days? Would that pose any challenges for IoT inspector to identify what endpoints devices are talking to when you have IP addresses of CDNs that corresponds to millions of different services?
Yep, definitely. It's a real huge challenge. CDNs, encrypted devices that use encrypted using DO or DOT, or devices potentially using encrypted SNI. Yeah, these pose problems. But there could be ways to circumvent. Say for instance, if devices certain devices all talk to the same IP address, we can kind of guess that, okay, if this IP address is associated with these class of devices, maybe this IP address is responsible for traffic of these devices. These are just open problems that we haven't looked into deeper yet. But these are definitely challenges. Snowden says that you have a copy of my book at your back. I can sign it for you. You gave a great presentation. Thank you, Mr. Snowden. Yes, for those of you who don't know, I have some books in my bookshelf.
Sorry, Ganesh. So this is Vilasha. I actually wanted to get your comment on this Yelp IoT idea. So first of all, thanks for the presentation, Danny.
Yeah.
So there is this concept of IoT label that was proposed by the Usable Security and Privacy Group from Carnegie Mellon.
Yep.
So how much does your idea of Yelp IoT deviate from what they've already done with the IoT labels?
For one, we try to be different in a sense that so Parsa, etc., from CMU, they try to develop, try to figure out, what goes into label, how to phrase those labels. Our goal is more about data release, about releasing real data, actual devices in our data set where people can actually search. Our labels will be simple because our data collected is actually quite limited in that, we will show users whether the device uses encrypted traffic, what kind of encryption they use, what kind of third parties devices talk to, and these are our just metrics. So in a way, our presentation is a more restricted subset of labels. We will borrow ideas from labels, but CMU's labels, but our will be more restricted. Our focus is more on, what devices users search for, real devices users search for, what information are they most, do they care about the most? So real consumers in the wild. So that's different from sort of the more in-lab theoretical aspects of the CMU's work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
In general, our research here is more turning towards like real consumers in the wild, because I see there's a lot of work on IoT, especially privacy in the lab, where researchers ask participants in a lab setting, what they would do, how would they choose, how do they perceive privacy. Our hypothesis is that some of these behaviors may not be transferable to like actual consumers who are actually about to buy devices. We want to understand behaviors like, do prices come into do prices and security come into play when it comes to real purchases? This is actually harder to study in a lab environment because the participants are actually not buying real devices for their own use. So that's one of our goals: study real consumers' behaviors.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions? Then do you want to very briefly mention the healthcare direction? I know you are interested in that.
Yeah, sure. IoT traffic could potentially review something about user behaviors. If you think about it, simple things like, what time, if you have a sleep monitor, say for instance, we did an empirical study where we have one graduate student, capture traffic of his sleep monitors while he actually slept. There are certain patterns in the traffic that denotes that he was actually awake. That's one example. Other examples include, motion detected cameras. When there are people at home, there's like more traffic rate from the motion detected cameras versus people not being at home. Another example is, just network traffic in general in a house. People being awake, more traffic. People sleeping, less traffic. So in general, can we use traffic from homes or IoT devices to, study human behaviors, especially health? Why health? Health monitoring is a hard problem because of compliance and adherence issues. If you think about traditional, monitoring of patients, consented patients, they have to wear, wearables like Fitbits or, other devices, monitors to monitor their conditions. But these devices can be taken off. These devices can be turned off at users' will. And that creates an issue for compliance and adherence because, there are some cases where, these traditional medical monitoring devices can't see into behaviors. And also, physicians would need to buy these devices and distribute to patients. That creates a scale and cost and management problems. The problem is that, with network traffic, it's always on. It's always there. There's not much modification you need. You don't need to buy additional hardware. The question is, can we just use network traffic, especially from our IoT smart home devices, to help us infer how the patient is doing? Whether the person is sleeping, whether the person wakes up at 4 a.m. in the night and check their Facebook, whether they're experiencing any sleep problems by looking at the traffic patterns from their sleep monitors. So things like that. So we're still in early exploratory phases. We're working with folks from Northwestern Medical School to look into this particular issue. So that's the healthcare problem that I'm looking at.
Thanks so much.
So Rafa asks the question, quote, does IoT Inspector collect data from smart speakers like Google Home or Amazon Alexa? Yes. We have users who share their data from Google Home and Alexas. In fact, lots of them. In fact, they make up for the majority of the devices in a data set. I don't know if Rafa has a follow-up with this question.
Okay. if there aren't any more questions.
Well, actually, if you're, since we have 90 people on the line here, let's talk about one open research that I like to,
Sure.
seek help with, see who's interested. So this is what I want to talk about. So earlier on in the lab, we have an MCREST camera. It is an American-made camera, US-based company. But but we looked at the network traffic. We found that MCREST camera has a lot of similarity to a Dahua camera in terms of network traffic. And we questioned, how is MCREST camera really a Dahua camera? And the reason we focus on Dahua is because, this is a company that whose cameras were hijacked in a Mirai botnet attack in 2016. Pretty bad name, Dahua. So if, I, a consumer, I buy MCREST, and if I know that, hey, actually under the hood, MCREST is actually Dahua, I won't use it because, this could point to some potential vulnerabilities based on the historical records of Dahua. So the question of IoT supply chain is actually a very hard question and very relevant question because, think about a consumer, if they buy one device, they might be actually buying underneath the hood a different device. So it turns out that MCREST is actually uses Dahua as an OEM, original equipment manufacturer. It's not on the website, but I found out about this by talking directly to a customer representative of MCREST. They told me directly that Dahua makes their cameras. So that confirms my suspicion that actually MCREST cameras are actually Dahua cameras, even though none of this information is in MCREST website. So the bigger question is that, who makes an IoT device? Who is the original equipment manufacturer? Who's the OEM? And which devices potentially share the same code? We have in our data set lots of devices having exactly the same TLS fingerprints. Basically, same cipher suites, same order of the cipher suites. This coincidence may point to the fact that multiple devices, different kinds of devices, may use the same code, potentially insecure code. Can we say who makes an IoT device? Because this answer provides consumers with transparency. If you buy camera A, it actually is made by camera B, company B, which is actually some shitty companies. So we want to know that. This is one active project that I'm working on. I think IoT Inspector's dataset is a good starting point. And if there are any folks interested in this issue, come talk to me as well. Yep. That's my spiel on some of the next steps I'm working on.
Okay, Danny, thank you so much. It was a super interesting talk and the engagement was great as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for the questions.
Yeah.
Yep. And hashtag Snowden, if I can get a signed copy of your book, great. Email me. Like your comments. All right. Thank you so much for the questions. All right.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Have a good rest of the Friday and good weekend.
Me too.
Okay.